Hey
everyone, welcome to, I don't even know what we're calling this. Just kind of a random teller meeting we're throwing in the middle of the week. I gave this presentation a few weeks ago, I think now, to the CFTC. So if you guys don't know, the CFTC, there's kind of one of the regulators of cryptocurrencies. You can just they have, I think it's called like a fintech working group, something like that. You can just go email them and they'll take a meeting with you. So anybody can go give a presentation to them for an hour, or I think it was 45 minutes. So they were all super cool. I also used to work there. So I was like a little bit probably more comfortable than a lot of you guys might be doing it, but they're super chill, super nice. They give you like lawyer-like answers to everything, which we'll kind of talk about. So not that you'll get any firm answers on anything, but I like to tell people just go talk to the CFTC, tell them what issues you're confused about, everything like that. Because, honestly, they're still trying to figure it all out too. So we shall get started. All right. So oracles, I think you guys, almost everyone here should know what an oracle is if you're on the Tellor chat. But when it comes to oracles, this talk is kind of about regulatory issues for oracles. The structure of the oracles do matter. So like whenever we say like an oracle, we're not just talking about Tellor, we're talking about if you have kind of various designs of oracles, could there be any sort of regulatory issues there? So you can think of oracles anything from just one person. So like, let's say you have a prediction market. If the prediction market team themselves is the oracle, that's an oracle setup. If you rely on one other person, say, you give it over to Mike here and he'll be your oracle, that works. It can also be a multi-sig. So there's like, you can rely on 3 people. You can also rely on a set of whitelisted nodes, very similar to a whitelist or a multi-sig. A decentralized exchange can also be an oracle. So if you're using Uniswap, so there's a whole lot of different structures, and depending on which sort of structure you are is probably, you're going to have different regulatory concerns along the way. So just keep that kind of in mind throughout this whole thing. So how Tellor works, this was my chance to tell the CFTC how my project works. You stake tokens, you report data, anybody can look at them and dispute them if they lied. So yeah, and then the smart contract can read data. So if you have a prediction market, say what's the weather going to be in 2 days, a reporter would stake their tokens, and then in 2 days when the event happens, they would report the weather data that is requested. If everyone thinks it's good, it stays on chain. If not, it gets disputed and somebody else puts it on chain. Pretty simple. But the keys of Tellor is it's sort of this decentralized system. Anybody can use it. Anybody can participate in it. It's not sort of this model where it's much different, say in traditional finance, the way that it would work. So, if you have a financial contract, you would have somebody would get to say what the settlement price is. So you would usually point to, oh, we're going to use LIBOR, and LIBOR is this very specific set of banks that get to control or say what that interest rate is. You could also use their services. So like IHS Market is one of them they use for like swaps and other contracts, or on futures contracts, they say, you like, what's the settlement price of oil? It's really, really tough. So usually they'll talk about, oh, it's a spot price at some specific cash exchange, or it's, some firm that gathers all of these prices at different spot exchange gets to report the price. How you set those up, those are sort of your oracles. The difference in decentralized land and crypto land is that, if you would say like, if the CME or a normal financial contract would say, okay, JP Morgan's going to be our oracle, they're going to tell us what the weather data is, and JP Morgan just flat out lies, like, you can take them to court. There's like, they probably did something illegal there, and you have that sort of fallback. Whereas in crypto land, you probably can't take your oracle provider to court if you're using Tellor, or I mean, maybe you could. Also could be a fair and a slightly interesting court case. But then at the same time, if you're using Uniswap as an oracle, could you take them to court over a bad price? Or, maybe, probably not. So a little bit different, something to think about. Making sense so far? Cool. Okay. Some of the issues. I guess when you talk about oracles, what are some of the issues that comes, like if the CFTC was going to try and regulate this and say something about oracles? Probably the biggest thing is that there's really no standards in the space, kind of like I was talking about the various different models. Everybody sort of does something different. And you also have a lot of problems when it comes to, so this is something I'm pushing them to sort of talk about more, is just settlement prices in general and best practices around it. So whenever this CME, they were self-certifying Bitcoin futures products. So they wanted to launch a Bitcoin futures product, and they had to send to the CFTC the settlement procedure, so how they were going to do it, and the CFTC had to approve it. So for all of these new products, the CFTC would approve that, oh, this is sort of a robust settlement price. And you had, so they took like a TWAP, VWAP across various different exchanges. They had this one firm that did this, and they had all these methodologies to show that, okay, like even if somebody wanted to go and manipulate the price of Bitcoin, it would be very hard to do it profitably in the long run. So this is sort of a robust procedure for settling the Bitcoin futures contracts. Obviously, that doesn't happen in crypto land. People are often using like Uniswap swap prices, spot prices. So like you'll just use the current Uniswap price, which like everybody knows you can manipulate that like really easily, 1% or 2%, probably really easy with flash loans, a whole lot. Even oracles that aren't Uniswap or these decentralized exchanges, if you're using Chainlink and there's only one person there, is that a risk? Maybe it's not a best practice. Like, what's your fallback? Do you want to have a fallback oracle? What are the risks there? People don't necessarily know what the best practices are, and especially when it comes to settlement prices, just sort of making it more robust so that way people can't sort of manipulate these things and hack your contracts, which we all know is kind of an issue. So this was sort of what had caused me to come and talk to the CFTC. So for those of you that don't know, Polymarket was I think they still are, they're a prediction market. Yeah, they still are, definitely. And they settled with the CFTC. So it means the CFTC contacted them, and I think that, they said they did some wrong, and they paid the CFTC, I think it was like $2 million or something. And they agreed to sort of change some of their things. There's a link down here. We can sort of link you to that action whenever they charge them. But some of the bigger pieces whenever it comes to prediction markets and to oracles are some of the details that they had in there. So when it comes to prediction markets, for those of you that don't know, prediction markets in the US are illegal. You have to be approved by the CFTC there are very few prediction markets. So there's like a few political forecasting prediction markets that are allowed. And those are kind of for like research purposes. So, if we're all gambling on who's going to be the president, people, there's a few kind of run by like university type organizations that say like, oh, well, maybe it has a better option of choosing the president. And there's some mixed research results there. But you can't just go and open up a prediction market in the same way you can't go and just open up a futures exchange because they look very, very similar. So you would have to go register in the US. So there's what's called a DCM, or a designated contract market. And that's basically what you think of whenever you think of like a futures or options exchange. You would have to go register as that. And then if you're one of those, you also need a clearing organization. So like DTCC, or one of these really large people who basically backstops you in case you fail. They make sure all those people are clearing your contracts, which is a whole different issue, because like everything on like Ethereum sort of clears things. Clearing means like settle. So, if I agree to send Brenda some money, then, Ethereum just does it. It's not like there's any sort of contract, or it's going to get sent in 3 days, or has to clear. You're not worried about anybody defaulting in the process of when we agree to it. That said, the other option is, if you're not in US regulatory land, there's like futures and options, and then there's swaps. And what are swaps? Swaps are basically anything that's not a futures or options contract. It's usually like not even what you would think about whenever you would think, oh, this is a swap contract. Basically anything that doesn't fit into the nice clean bucket of you have to be a DCM would be like, well, it's probably just a swap. So, like most of the DeFi products, like in the Polymarket action, I think they said that they would have to go register as a SEF, which is a swap execution facility, which normal people don't use those. Normal people don't care about them. They're for really big guys who do like interest rate swaps and things like that. But that's like what they want them to go register as, because the prediction market nature of it doesn't really fit into some of the things that they were doing, doesn't really fit cleanly into this is a futures or options product. So we'll just say you have to go register as a SEF, which doesn't really make sense, but whatever. You guys can settle. And that's what they did. They settled, and they're going to work on it. But anyway, so history of US regulations aside, back to the case, whenever they talked about it, if you guys did read that, they talked a lot about Polymarket, and the reason that it needed to go register was basically that it wasn't decentralized. This was a super interesting fact, because and of course I talked to some people there, and they were saying, well, it's not necessarily one. Just keep in mind that whenever you're talking about, okay, well, it's one thing or another, a lot of it, they said, was just facts and circumstances. So, in the same way, this is like a Delaware C Corp, that's a fact and circumstance. Like, it's sort of the sum of it all adds up to needing to go register. It's hard to really pinpoint which specific piece would make sense. And that's what we want to do, though. The first thing that they did, which we obviously knew was wrong, we knew from SEC actions going back to like Ether Delta, they ran a centralized website that everyone was using to access and trade these platforms. That's like always a big no-no. If people want to come and trade on your platform, they shouldn't be doing so directly through the website, trading these illegal platform products. We knew that was an issue, and they also they collected people's email addresses and had like logins for it. It wasn't even like, oh, anybody could do it. Like they were like, it was like just a base website, like not decentralized in any way. And that was sort of strike number one. But we all knew that, we knew that would be a likely piece of contention going back to, like I was saying, the Ether Delta piece, or, Uniswap recently settled on, if you saw, Uniswap took off a whole bunch of products from their website because they weren't compliant, basically don't host products that would be illegal. And then you also had even like the old relayers. So if you remember like the 0x relayers, they kind of had a lot of regulatory issues just because even though 0x was decentralized and they were doing this thing on decentralized, it was the person that was actually hosting the website that everybody knew you're going to be the target. So don't do that. But that said, the bigger issue, kind of for oracles, is this kind of long word dump I put here where, should I read it? Yeah, any dispute or ambiguity in the market resolution meaning who wins, determination of which contracts are winners and losers is resolved by Polymarket's Market Integrity Committee, which is staffed solely by Polymarket. So whenever they say resolution process, that's who's your oracle. That's what that means. So who's resolving the financial contract, and basically it was them. They were the oracle. And that was, it seems from reading this, I mean, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like that might be a no-no in terms of decentralization. It's hard to say that you're decentralized whenever they're sort of resolving it themselves. So, you know, that was a no-no. And then kind of like, okay, well, what does that mean? And this is where we get into, okay, well, what is the regulation for oracles in this? So, okay, so it's bad if you're the centralized oracle. Okay, so if Polymarket is so we can just do hypotheticals in the Polymarket case. Let's say they had a decentralized website, but they were the sole oracle. Do they still have to register would be the question. Probably, you would say, you know, that would be, they're still kind of a centralized product that you can still rip off all of your customers if you want to. So if you're coming at it from like a consumer protection standpoint, like, yeah, they should probably go register. That would be bad. Okay. But okay, let's say, well, they don't want to do it. They know that they don't want to be centralized and go register. They're going to give it to Brenda. Brenda's going to be their oracle. So same with, instead of them being the one person, they're going to give it to Brenda. It's still, they know Brenda, they can call her. Does Brenda have to register? Do they still have to register? Who's it on? Maybe, does Brenda, like, where would she fit? We don't know. Obviously, if it's Brenda or if it's a whitelisted group of people, do they have to register? Don't know. Would Tellor have to register? We don't know. And that's kind of where it stands now. So like, you know, it's bad to resolve it yourself. There's a lot of consumer protection issues if it's one person and then going on, it's not. And from our conversation with them, there's almost a difference in what you do as an oracle, and this is really important. So almost like the marketing matters. So we knew the marketing mattered, like when it comes to ICOs. So, you know, in the other crypto sense, like if you would say like, come invest in my shitcoin, you're going to make tons of money, that's bad. But if you just put out a shitcoin and said like, buy it, you might lose money, that's okay. Like, even though it's the exact same action, it's really how you talk about it that matters. And in this case, you know, in talking with them and talking with some other people, marketing actually matters for what your oracle does. So since they were the centralized resolution service, and they sort of called themselves that, and said that they were going to make consumers whole, that's sort of a no-no, because then you're sort of reliant on them. However, you could imagine, say, like, let's imagine like a perfect oracle that was just like some computer up in space running that grabbed API queries. If that was the case and you were using this soulless data fetching machine to go get it, obviously that can't register. That's just sort of this technology that you're using. So you want to, as an oracle, what you want to do is you want to avoid saying things like, we're resolving markets for Polymarket. We're making sure that their contracts are up to date, and we're making sure that all the consumers are protected and that they get it. Which instead, what you want to say is like, hey, we put data on chain. Polymarket tipped our reporters and they threw it on chain. That's what we do. We don't know what it's being used for. We don't know what it's in any way for, or, you know, we sort of hold no reservations and we make no claims as to the accuracy. And that's kind of where you want to be as an oracle, more of this technology provider versus this almost a financial service platform, which is, say, more of what, you know, so a lot of it does, I guess, have to come down to marketing, which is not as satisfying. But I think, you know, I would say probably puts Chainlink or some of the others, if you're making like partnership announcements. So like you would want to really avoid saying like, we're partnering with Polymarket to resolve all of their markets. Don't say that. Or, you know, any of these financial platforms, you wouldn't want to say that. You would just want to say like,
or go register, right?
yeah, you wouldn't want to say anything. You would just want to be like, they're using us. Or, you know, as much as like you would use the Mac or something like that. It's like you're just, it's a piece of technology. And that's kind of how you want to be seen. So that was a big thing we took out of the meeting with them. And then I'm like almost done already. Other pieces too. This is sort of another issue for oracles too, kind of going, I know I'm all over the place, going back to settlement prices. So let's say Polymarket has a derivatives contract that settles to Coinbase's price or market. Coinbase didn't necessarily approve that. Could Coinbase sue Polymarket for doing that? Probably. Because basically it gives people an incentive to go and manipulate prices on Coinbase. So does defining a data source make it bad? You know, if you would say like, because obviously in this case, if Coinbase were to say, you know, like we'll be the oracle and we'll put the price in, or, you know, we'll sign our API messages and you can put them in. This was how Compound worked. And I think that's why Coinbase probably moves away from it. Coinbase could say sign all of their prices and then anybody could use them in their smart contracts. They used to do this. The problem would be is then if you're using it, are you the oracle? Does Coinbase then have to go register or make some sort of claim as to the integrity of their markets? And I don't know if they would want to do that. And not that we would know if they would even have to go register, you know, going back a slide. So yeah, even Uniswap as well. So, you know, Uniswap's, I think they've actually calmed down as far as like pushing people to use them as an oracle. Probably for, you know, they're becoming much more regulatory conscious. You know, if you're an exchange and you push people to use you as an oracle, what sort of legal risks do you have there? Because is it, yeah, we don't necessarily know. And yeah, I think there would definitely be some better guidelines from the CFTC for people, just kind of even just educating them on A, why you don't want to use that, and B, why it might be illegal for you to just use one exchange's prices. So yeah, I guess that would be some of the issues that oracles are facing. Here, I think the biggest piece is going to be we want to make sure that, you know, at least from Tellor's standpoint, going forward on the marketing, we are a technology provider, but then it also gets weird because we want to educate them as well, just kind of being good people into making good settlement prices and actually making things more robust so that way they also don't get in trouble. But that was kind of it for my presentation. Hopefully you guys learned something today. Any questions, or how can I answer anything?
I have a question.
Please.
I'm sure everyone's really curious about your thoughts on yesterday's executive order, but if you were to go back to the CFTC and give this presentation again, do you think there would be any different guidances, or is it pretty much the same?
No, I mean, based on the executive order.
Right.
No, I mean, the executive order was nothing. I mean,
Yeah.
it was like I don't think it really did anything. I think, you know, basically it said that the agencies are going to look into crypto, which obviously they all already are and have been. So I don't really see how it did anything. Maybe it's moving the CBDC a little closer. So, if the central bank digital currencies, but that's like a whole nother discussion, happy to talk about it. But yeah, CBDCs in general maybe would help some of these issues because it would sort of force people to talk about them. And, I think the biggest problem with like the CFTC's regulations when it comes to crypto is you have these clean buckets, similar to like I was talking about, you're either a futures or an options product, and then you go do this registration, or you're a swap facility and you go and register as a swap, and then everything you need a multi-billion-dollar clearinghouse to back you. And it's like, and then you come from the crypto land and you're like, man, like I don't need a clearinghouse. I'm not one of these products that's ever been seen before. Where do I fit in? And usually the way that most crypto people have done it now is they're like, well, screw talking to the CFTC. I obviously don't fit in. There's enough regulatory gray area and the fines aren't big enough for me to care. I'm just going to go with it. And they go and do their own thing. If you're talking about from a consumer protection standpoint, like you want to make it easy for people to register and for them to share, like, okay, like these are good products. These are things like, because you can do crypto products, like say even like, financial products that are good, like a Uniswap, for instance. Like it's a fair financial product that's out there. It works. There's obviously a whole lot of risks to it. But like the way that you would help that from a consumer protection standpoint would just be more kind of education, and then also making sure that, you don't have front ends listing obvious scams and things like that. So there would be ways to help that wouldn't necessarily be large regulatory burdens, especially on, like what's Uniswap for the longest time was like 20 people, and, Tellor's 13 people. These teams are really small. Like we don't have money for lawyers. So, yeah. Any other questions?
What are the goals of the agencies besides consumer protection?
So Tally says, what are the goals of the agencies beside consumer protection? So usually there's like two pieces to like most of these agencies, where it's like consumer protection and then market integrity. So like market integrity would be like, you want to prevent the next financial crisis. So like, although you're protecting consumers, if everyone is long housing, that's bad. So you have to make sure you look at kind of the macro risks overall. And to be honest, crypto's like, so like, even if you were doing consumer protection and everyone was like, you had to do an educational course before you invested in Bitcoin. Obviously, if like all of the 401ks in the world were nothing but Bitcoin, that would be like a systemic risk to the system. So you'd want to pay attention to that, but crypto's so tiny. I mean, I think somebody posted like what Ethereum's like smaller than the market cap of Tesla. I think it's still, we're still like nowhere there. We're like this, most of crypto, like we're the size of like 2 banks, like all of it. So it's just, we're not quite at the size where we're going to blow up an economy. We're basically just going to make a bunch of 20-year-olds broke, but it's probably not integral to market stability. I think like, yeah, like some of the bigger issues would be people pushing, probably the bigger issues for crypto is, and when it becomes kind of a risk is once Wall Street does jump on and then we start financializing all of the products. So then, you get like you get like crazy leveraged Bitcoins and things like that. And people start trading them and making more traditional financial products out of them. That's where you're going to have some of the bigger risks. Or just not using it in general, like some of the bigger risks with settlement on like the Bitcoin futures. Whenever, they were certifying those, it came about like, well, what do you do about finality? Like technically you can settle a futures contract and then they can like go and revert the entire thing if they hack the mining network. So, you could, does it still make sense? And like, can you even do products on Bitcoin because none of it's actually final? Like, because a lot of these products, there was a whole lot of talks back in 2017, 2018 about like what physical delivery of Bitcoin meant. Because so if you had like a physically delivered product of corn, so you can buy like a corn futures contract, and like there's actually going to be like a giant grain silo of corn that gets delivered from some farmer to some producer. And, can you do those kind of financial products on Bitcoin? Some people said yes, but other people were like, well, it's not finalized ever. Like theoretically, like none of the Bitcoin blocks are final. So you could go back and reverse them. So who would be at fault there? Anyway, rambling again. Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right.
It does.
Anything else? Spuddy, you turned your camera on.
I am, nope, I don't know.
Nope, Spuddy doesn't have anything.
What are the disadvantages of pursuing action from the regulator's standpoint?
So Tally says, what are the disadvantages or advantages from pursuing regulation? So the biggest thing with kind of crypto in general is that they've had this like hands-off approach where they haven't really come down hard on the hammer in a lot of ways. Especially under the Trump administration, they wanted to seem very pro-innovation. So like you don't want to look like you're squashing the next Facebook. That would be bad. You want to make sure that your country's competitive, but then at the same time, you want to sort of go after things. I think just manpower wise, there's so many crypto projects they can't possibly go after all of us. And we're also, like I was saying, we're really, really little. So, like if I think like, there were like multiple billion-dollar fines like over the past few years from like other like large banks, and like they frequently pay these ridiculous fines that like are more than entire market caps of the top coins. So, does it make sense to put your staff time and energy into this? Probably not yet. You want to a little bit, but it doesn't. And then they also, before they understand something, they don't necessarily want to give too much guidance on it. It's really nice from a regulatory standpoint when you can just say like, we're allowed to go after you no matter what. So like, just don't mess up. It's like, at the same way, like police in general, like it's always really nice for them to say like, well, you're jaywalking or you're, disorderly conduct or something like that. Like they always have a reason to arrest you if they don't like you, and they'll probably get away with it. And they like sort of having that flexibility. Whereas if you nail down the rules completely, you get a whole lot of problems because then it's clear what people have to go around. So, in like traditional finance, they've sort of backed themselves into corners in a lot of ways where, they lay out the rule set in a lot of ways, and then they try and pass a new rule or try and charge somebody. And then the bank that they're charging with something comes back and sues the agency for charging them with something. And then, the whole thing goes to trial, or they end up settling for a minuscule amount. It's just much better if you're like, actually, you guys do have to go fit into these buckets. Don't make us mad, or we're going to sort of force you to go fit into these buckets, but you don't. And I think that's a big piece of it. So awesome.
I got one more question, actually. You talked a lot about just kind of like Uniswap. I feel like the general consensus is that, it's decentralized. There are AMMs, and they even have the TWAP to kind of mitigate the risks. So what kind of risks are you referring to?
I'll stop my share. Kind of just the risks of an attack, like on any exchange. So the biggest risks with a Uniswap or something like that, using them as an oracle, is like, what happens if the liquidity all dries up? There's not really anybody, they're super easy to attack if there's not a whole lot of liquidity. And a lot of the times the liquidity provided on these things is just a handful of people. So, so even though it is decentralized and anybody can come on and provide liquidity, if you're relying, a lot of the reason people rely on Uniswap is like, oh, well, it can be super, super fast. So, we can just rely on it to always be up to date. What happens if those main 5 liquidity providers pull their liquidity from Uniswap, and then all of a sudden 95% of the liquidity is gone there, and now your contract can be thrown for, you know, $100,000. They can, you know, double their earnings on a derivative contract. That would be a bad thing. So definitely, that's more of the risk in my mind when using one of these things. It's more, you can use Uniswap, but if you do like a nice TWAP or you have backup oracles, like that can sort of work. But using just like a spot price on an exchange, you're really reliant on a whole lot of things going right. So
Cool.
anyway, all right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I see some other people in the room. So thanks everyone. And yeah, talk to you guys soon.